Everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Manisha, for those of you who don't know me, and this is my husband, Dambara. And it's such a pleasure to see all your shining faces and bright eyes and wonderful smiles. Thank you for coming and spending the morning with us. This week's topic, how do we face our challenges? That's something that we can use every day, every hour of every day, some advice on how to face our challenges, because they will come to us. Devi and Jyotish, who are the spiritual directors of Ananda Worldwide, have been with Ananda, worked with Swamiji from the very early years, and so have a large span of experience and wisdom immersed in his guidance and wisdom in the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. They're wonderful souls. And Devi tells a story how in the early years of Ananda there was, as there often is, a gentleman who had moved into the meditation retreat, which was the only physical manifestation of Ananda in the early days, out at the meditation retreat, and that he wasn't really getting along with anybody, and he rubbed everybody the wrong way, and he was rude and not very cooperative and questioned everything and thought his way was better, and he was just really a trial for everybody. And Jyotish and Devi were talking with Swami one day, and they asked him, how do you think this gentleman is doing? And Swami answered, he's doing the best he can for who he is and his circumstances. And that really struck Devi because it was such a kind way to look at this man's efforts to fit in and the things he was struggling with and working with, that he really was doing the best he could given who he is and the circumstances he had found himself in. And so Devi really remembered that over the years. And decades later, they were again having a conversation with Swamiji, and at that point, he had already passed the mantle to them to be the spiritual directors of Ananda Worldwide, and he was going into more of a book writing, inward time of his life. And so during this conversation, it just occurred to Devi to ask him, how are we doing? How are we doing with Ananda's work, with your vision of how things should go? And Swami answered, you're doing the best you can, given who you are and the circumstances you find yourself in. And Devi was just really struck, again, by his answer, because she had expected some heart-melting statement of, I am so pleased to have been able to hand this off to somebody so reliable and devoted, and I feel that you've really worked hard to attune yourself with Master's teachings and to find some praise. And yet he had given her exactly the same response that he had given this person who had caused so much angst in the very early years of Ananda. It was exactly the same outlook. But she was wise enough to realize that it really was high praise to be doing the best you can in the situation that you find yourself in, given who you are and given your circumstances. That is high praise to be acknowledged for doing the best you can. There was another woman who was talking with Swamiji, and she was facing some huge challenge in her life. And she lamented, if only I knew what I had done in previous lives to know why I've drawn this test to myself. If I knew why I was in this predicament, it would be so much easier. And Swami looked at her and said, I don't see how that would help in the least, because your job, regardless of whether you know the backstory or not, is to do the best you can. It wouldn't change a thing knowing what you had done all those lifetimes ago. You're in this situation now. This is what you're dealing with who you are and the circumstances that you're in. We don't always know the backstory. Sometimes we do if we know all the players involved and it happened in this lifetime or in the last 5 minutes, so you actually remember it. But most of the time, you don't know the backstory. There's this wonderful story in the Bhagavad Gita. And my apologies ahead of time for all the people who know the Bhagavad Gita so well, actually the Mahabharata so well, because I know I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but I'll still be able to illustrate my point. The Mahabharata, for those who aren't familiar with it, is an enormous epic that is one of the main spiritual writings in Indian philosophy. And the Bhagavad Gita, which we base so much of our teachings on, is just one small segment out of the Mahabharata. So it's a wonderful story. Daiva tells it beautifully. Every once in a while, he does a series where he tells the story of the Bhagavad Gita, and it's just thrilling. He has this great storytelling ability, and he remembers the details, and he remembers them accurately. So he has a great way of telling the Mahabharata. If you ever have the opportunity to listen to his telling, move mountain and earth so that you can hear it. It's wonderful. But this particular story has to do with a king who is out hunting with his courtiers, and he sees this beautiful woman, and instantly he falls in love with her, and he is just smitten to his core. He must have this woman. He must marry this woman. And so she agrees, and they marry. And when she agrees, she says, I will marry you on one condition, that you must never question anything I do. And he was so smitten with her that he agreed that he would never question anything she did. So they married, and in just a short while, she became pregnant and bore a son. The king was just jubilant because now he had an heir to his throne. It was a healthy, strong, beautiful boy. Nothing could make him happier than having this woman that he loved desperately and now an heir. And his wife, the queen, rose from her birthing bed, carried the infant down to the river, and drowned the baby in the water. And the king was just beside himself with surprise and anguish. And his son, she had drowned his son, but he had promised never to question anything she did. And so he didn't. And he composed himself, and he accepted the death of his son, and he mourned the loss of his heir. And the next year, she again gave birth to a beautiful son, robust, vibrant, beautiful son. And the king rejoiced and watched as his wife rose from her birthing bed and carried the infant down to the river and drowned him in the water. This happened 6 times. And the king could not understand, was beside himself with grief, but he had promised never to question anything she did. And so he kept his promise. And then the 7th year, the 7th son, she rose from her birthing bed, and he said, my dear, my love, my wife, I cannot bear it any longer. Why do you kill these sons? Why do you drown them in the water? And she said, oh, my husband, if only you had waited. If only you had let me finish this one last child, everything would have been well between us. Now that you have questioned me, I cannot stay with you. And she took the son into the forest, and she raised him in the forest. Now this particular son turns out to play a major role in the Mahabharata and shapes a lot of the Bhagavad Gita by his presence in the story. So in one regard, it's good that she didn't drown this 7th son. But the backstory, which the Mahabharata tells us, is that there were 7 rishis, very highly advanced souls, who were meditating on the astral plane in deep meditation, blessing the world with their energy and their wisdom and their inner strength. And a beautiful woman had come and gone into the pool, the pond where they were meditating. And she hadn't seen them because they were so quiet, and they hadn't heard her because she was so quiet. But she went in and she was bathing in the pond. And her splashing brought them out of their meditation, and they saw her nakedness. And her husband, who was, they were mages, they weren't rishis. There was a rishi. Is that the right word? A demon? Okay. Her husband, who was a demon, was outraged that these 7 mages had seen his wife's nakedness, and he cursed them. He cursed them that they would have to re-enter that they would have to be reborn into the physical plane and re-enter the cycle of karma and be reborn and reborn and reborn until they had worked out a whole new set of karma. And the mages were absolutely appalled that they had brought them on themselves so innocently, so unknowingly. And they begged the rishi to have compassion, and he refused. He said, "No, this is a horrible thing that you have done, and I will not take away this curse from you." So the Mother Ganges, Mother Ganga, had witnessed all of this, and she took pity on the 7 mages. And she proposed that they be born to her, and that she would drown them in her waters before they had taken more than just a few breaths, so that they could re-emerge into the spirit without having created any karma that they would have to spend lifetimes working through. And the rishi said, "Yes, I agree to this on one condition, that nobody question what you are doing." And that was a big, who would not question having their son drowned in the river? But she agreed to the conditions, and she set in motion. She appeared before the king, and the marriage happened, and she was able to save 6 of the mages from the horrible future of reincarnating again and again and again to work out karma. So it's true that knowing the backstory makes you feel a little bit better about the 6 drowned infants. But whether you know the backstory or not, the same situation holds true, that you do the best you can given who you are and the circumstances that you find yourself in. The reading also goes on to talk about the 3 gunas, the 3 aspects of human consciousness: sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. Sattvic energy is very calm and centered, moves upward in our spine. Rajasic energy is very active and goes side to side and takes us from one extreme to another. And tamasic energy is very stagnant. It doesn't move. It can trap us and just hold us in one place. It's very cloying. It's like a dead swamp is tamasic energy. But we can use rajasic energy to pull us out of tamasic energy, to bring us up to sattvic energy. We can get ourselves up off of the couch and go for a brisk walk so that we can enjoy the beauty of nature in God's world. So all 3 of them can be used. And the more alert and aware you are of how you're using those, the more you can use them consciously and actually make them work for you. And our reading talks about a more subtle point that we don't always think about, that the tasks that come to us also have the characteristics of these 3 gunas. The sattvic tests are like smoke from a fire. It can conceal the flames, but with a breath of wind, or in our case, a very strong wind, can blow that smoke away in no time at all, and it's just gone. And what does that look like in real life? When I was very young, it was in the age before synthetic clothing, so everything was either silk or cotton or wool or linen. All of those need to be ironed. So a big part of our weekly chores, my sister and I, was to iron the family's clothing. And the first part of and my mom taught both of us how to do that, starting with simple things and going up to more complex clothing until we could really understand the art of ironing. And our first chore was always to go to everybody's closet and gather all the empty hangers and put them in a pile so they were ready for the clothes as they came off the ironing board. And those hangers were my mother's nemesis. They have that odd shape and they get tangled up and hooked on each other, and she would pick one up and just like try to get it loose, and she hated those hangers. She just hated them. She'd get it loose and she'd go on with her ironing. And my sister and I would stand there and watch this. And we learned that behavior from her, to hate those hangers. So years later, when I was doing my own ironing, I found myself repeating this pattern, that I would just pick it up and I would trickle it in her. But I realized that I really wasn't feeling any anger or frustration. I was just mimicking my mother. And I thought, this is not my test. This is my mother's test. I don't have this horrible nemesis of the hangers. They're actually sort of a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, if I move that there and I can untangle it, and there, it's free. And it was fun. I could extricate it very easily looking at the puzzle of it. So that test was like a breath on the smoke that revealed the fire underneath, and it just went away so easily. In that one session with one hanger, I got rid of that nemesis of the hangers. Another example is that when I first came to Ananda, I yearned to have someone from my family become just as enchanted with Ananda as I was. I wanted to share Ananda with one of my family members, and I would bring this sister or that or this brother or my mom. I would bring them to Sunday service and then wait expectantly, and nothing. It was not for them. It was just for me. And I always felt a loneliness that I didn't have someone in my family sharing Ananda with me. And then Bhagavati moved in next door to me about, within a few months of me coming to Ananda, Bhagavati moved in. Bhagavati lives in the village now, and she's an incredible musician, and she and her husband are the musical directors of Ananda Village. So we've stayed with the path over all these years. And the first time I met Bhagavati, she knocked on my door early one morning and she said, "I can't get the key of my door to work. Can I see your key? Does it look like my key?" And I said, "Just a minute, let me see if I can find it." And she said, "Never mind, you actually answered the real question I had. Do we have to lock our doors?" And so that was our introduction, that we were on the same page, and we became very good friends, and we went on walks together. And she was our wedding planner, and I was their wedding planner. I mean, we've just been great friends over the years. And after we'd known each other for about 5 years, we discovered that we were actually cousins. Her father's brother's son married my brother's wife's second cousin's daughter. There's a lot of connections there, 2 marriages, but Bhagavati and I are cousins. And realizing that she was my cousin just completely answered that yearning I had to have a family member join me in Ananda. I told this story to Asha, and she says, "Whatever works." So that also was just a breath on the smoke, and it took away that test for me. I don't have to yearn for a family member to be a part of Ananda with me. Then there's the Rajasic tests, and you have to work at those a little bit more. It's rust on a mirror. You have to put elbow grease in it, and you have to take some time working at it. And you don't know exactly how much progress you're making, or, when am I going to be done with this? You don't really, it takes time and it's hard work. I had a friend who was working at the same company as I was. She was in another department, and the man who was in charge of her department he was not a good boss. He would very subtly criticize people, so they knew that he really didn't have a very high opinion of them, and he just sort of undermined their self-confidence and their self-worth. He was outwardly friendly, but with these little comments here and there, people realized that he didn't think much of them, and it just really undermined the integrity and the companionship and the partnership within his department. And so my friend that worked in that department would talk to me about this. And she decided that she was going to treat him as a friend. She was going to always assume the best from him. She was going to treat him as the person he was aspiring to be, rather than the person he had been all this time. And she had to work really hard at it, because he really did get in everybody's face quite often. And she would think, oh, why did he say that? And she'd have to talk to me, and she'd talk to her husband, and there was just she had to work at it a lot to maintain this friendship. And over time, it changed the pattern within the department, that other people would talk to her, and she would explain her strategy, and she would point out the good things that he did. And he's really good at this, and he's really good at that. Yeah, he sucks at that, but he's really good at these other things. And gradually, he gained more confidence. He didn't feel like everybody was against him, even though it was of his own making. He didn't know that. He didn't realize that. He didn't know how else to be in that situation. But gradually, it changed the fiber of that department, and they started getting along better. When they got along better, his managerial abilities improved, and it helped. But it took a lot of hard work on her part, and it took a long time for all the pieces to incorporate and rise together. So I think about that often when somebody is really irritating me, or somebody is saying something that I think, that was just so mean to say it that way. That wasn't kind. And I treat that person as if he or she is the person he's trying to become, rather than the person she used to be. Because if you think of the person always where they used to be, you hold them there. My poor husband always ends up being a subject of my stories. And when I first met Don Buddha, I formed the opinion of him that he had a sweet tooth. He loved going to bakeries. If we went into a new town, he would always, let's go to that bakery. And, he'd get like 12 things instead of 2. He just, that looks good. And then, over the next few days, he'd eat them. So I formed this opinion of him that he had a sweet tooth. And so I would mention that every once in a while to other people or to himself. I was thinking of your sweet tooth. And he never liked hearing that. And I thought, well, that's sort of odd. You obviously have a sweet tooth. But then I realized he was trying to move away from that every time I mentioned to anybody, even myself, that he had a sweet tooth, it held him there. And he was trying to move away from that and eat more consciously. And he's a very healthy eater. So he was trying to make that a bigger part of his diet and a bigger part of his consciousness. And then I was holding him trapped back there. So you can help people so much by always responding to them, always treating them as the best they can be, rather than that one instance where they told you something that was mean or unnecessary or tactless. Just ignore that. Pretend it didn't happen. Focus on where they're going toward, and you will help them go toward that, which in my friend's case made life a lot easier for her. The department got along really a lot better. But it took time. It took hard work and time. So that was smoke on the mirror. Rust on the mirror. That was a Rajasic test that she faced. Not only did it improve her relationship with this one gentleman, it improved all of her relationships. She found herself being less judgmental of everybody in general, that it's something that she incorporated into her personality. Unbeknownst to herself, it sort of snuck in there and made her a more accepting person. And she also mentioned how she became less judgmental of herself, which was a big thing. She had been raised to be judgmental of herself. So this helped her improve what was going on in her own self-talk. So that was a bonus that she hadn't been working on and hadn't realized, and it came to her anyway. So sometimes we don't recognize our tests right away for what they truly are. And it comes as a surprise after the fact or during the test that, oh, this is actually helping me with something that is very central to the energy that I'm stuck in. This helps me more than it helps them. It really helps me. Then there's the tamasic tests. And I think of these as tests that are just very deeply rooted in our chakras. And they're embedded with samskars that just hit us at a very deep level, that it's hard for us to even look at them and process them. It doesn't matter how hard you work at it and how much time you give it, it needs to come to gestation, just like the baby in the womb. You can't hurry a baby during a pregnancy. It's going to take however long it's going to take. Things have to happen. The matrix has to be in place. Things have to all work together and it has to develop. This part can't develop faster than this part. It all comes together. This waits for this and this waits for this, and it all just happens in the time that it takes for all of it to develop so that the next step can take place. And so I think of deep emotions around this one. And we have 2 cats, and they're litter mates, they're sisters. So they're pretty close together, genetically, environmentally. We've had them both since they were born. And one of the cats is just a cheerful little cat, and she's my little cheerleader. When you go to pet her, she goes up on her tippy toes, and she's just so cheerful and happy. And she goes outside, and she's the good hunter, and she just loves being outdoors, being a farm cat. She just loves her life. And then her sister is very afraid and has been afraid ever since the day that we brought them home. They both, of course, were nervous when we brought them home, but Serena has never really lost her fear. So she's afraid of everything, and she spends a lot of time cowering. Now, of these 2 cats that have lived with us over the years, the fearful cat and the cheerful cat, so many things have happened to my fearful cat. I was working on a project, and I had a 2x4 leaning up against the wall. That 2x4 went and landed on my fearful cat. Forks jump off the counter and land on her. I'll trip over her. I've never tripped over Bliss. And, they're around about the same amount of time. I really think that she draws things to her because of her fear. The fear came first, and now the fearful things are happening to her. Who would have expected a 2x4 to come out of nowhere and hit you on the head? But if she's afraid all the time, then you draw that to you. So a lot of times you can work through something just by being aware of what's going on. Our quality for the week, alertness. The thing that really helps with all these tests is to be aware that they're happening, and aware of your actions, and aware of the response, the consequences of your actions. That didn't work. I'm not going to try that one again. I'm consciously not going to try that again. I'm not going to use that phrase because that makes Dambara angry when I use that phrase. I'm not going to say that phrase anymore. So pay attention to the consequences of your actions. Then you know that that's taking you in the direction you want to go, or it's not really. It's keeping you back in the confusion and the anger and the frustration or the irritation, all those things that are not where you want to be. If you can move forward and pay attention to what comes to you and what happens as a result, then you have a really much better chance of understanding what those tests are, so they don't have to keep coming to you, so that you'll finally get it. The thing that you do when a Sattvic test comes to you is that you do the best you can, given who you are and the circumstances you find yourself in. And you pay attention to the results of your actions. And what do you do with a Rajasic test? You do the best you can for as long as you need to, given who you are and the circumstances you find yourself in. And with a Tamasic test, you do the best you can. It's hard, because a lot of times with Tamasic tests, you don't know what's going on, but you do the best you can, given who you are and the circumstances you find yourself in. Swami also talks about that facing the test is like pulling a nail out of the board. You don't know how much nail is left in that board. If you don't work at it at all, the nail is never going to come out of the board. It's just going to always be there. But if you work at it and work at it and work at it, it is going to come out of the board. So you do the best you can, given who you are and the circumstances you find yourself in.